Okay guys, so we're going to go through some range of motion assessments for the shoulder joint. So there's going to be both passive and active elements to this. So basically when we talk about active range of motion, we're talking about the amount of range of motion someone can work through using their own muscles actively and generally against the force of gravity in a lot of cases, okay? When it comes to passive range of motion, we're talking about the amount of range of motion someone's joint can be brought through using external force, so typically some sort of manual assessor. So if I'm holding one of Paddy's limbs and I take a joint through a particular range of motion, that's passive, okay? And generally you're going to have a little bit more passive range of motion than active range of motion in a lot of cases, and of course that is force dependent in terms of how far you want to push a joint. So we'll go through some of those points as we go through the shoulder joint. So first things first, we want to start with shoulder flexion. So if you're familiar with the anatomy content, you'll be aware that shoulder flexion is bringing the arm up over the head. Okay, so that's the basic movement of shoulder flexion. So this is important for exercises such as pull down exercises, any overhead exercises, basically anything where your hand is going to be getting overhead. So if you're thinking about having a client do something like a pull up or a chin up, or even hanging from a bar, doing hanging leg raises, anything like that, you might want to be aware of their shoulder flexion range of motion. Now, for most people, you're not going to need to screen for this, but if it's the case, you know, that someone says they're having lots of problems with a particular exercise, this might be something you want to take a look at, just see what they have available. So how am I going to do that? I'm going to start by getting Paddy to sit facing that wall if you can. Then what I'm going to have a look at is, okay Paddy, you put your hand up overhead, and I'm basically looking at how much range of motion he's able to get through. So what we can see, and you can see from the angle of the camera, is that he's getting up to 180 degrees of shoulder flexion just fine, okay? So if you're just looking from that side on angle, you might miss a bit, because if I saw that he was getting 180 degrees, but he had to really bring the arm out to the side to do that, and it was kind of just giving that bit of an illusion, that might give me an idea that there might be a shortage of range of motion there for him actively. But he's getting up fine, up overhead. Doesn't seem to be a problem there for him. You know, if a client had pain, you might ask them, is that a comfortable position? But that looks to be just fine for Paddy, so it's not something I'm going to be concerned about, and we can exercise just fine from there, okay? So you can put the arm down again for me, Paddy. And another thing you want to look at there, guys, is if you are doing that sort of assessment on someone, what you might want to do is see if there's any sort of compensation. So if Paddy comes up to maybe 150, 160 degrees, he gets to there, and then he leans back loads, that can basically give me a false positive, because what I'm thinking there is, oh look, he's got about 180 degrees of range of motion, but it's actually coming as a result of him leaning back here at the spine rather than coming from the shoulder joint. So that's fine, Paddy. That's something you always have to be mindful of when assessing for range of motion. Are you getting a pure reading in terms of, is this something that's coming purely from that joint, or are there other joints that are compensating? And that might give you an idea of what is going on with someone, okay? So we're not trying to create any diagnoses or anything here, but we're just trying to see what does our client have available. That's all we're trying to establish here, okay? So then, Paddy, if you face the front again, the next kind of range of motion we might be interested in is shoulder abduction. So that's bringing the arm out to the side. So he's going as far as there, that's absolutely fine. And then the rest of the shoulder abduction range of motion is going all the way up overhead, okay? So that's going to involve him actually having to rotate a little bit. So if he keeps his hand like that, facing down, he's not going to get up the rest of the range of motion. But if he twists his hand in and goes overhead, that's fine. So normally if you're assessing shoulder abduction range of motion, you'll say, okay, thumb up towards the ceiling and up over your head, as far as you can go. And someone should be able to get up more or less to the same position as they would in shoulder flexion range of motion. But what you might find in some clients who do have shoulder pain is that if they do keep the hand down, so as you did the first time, Paddy, and you come up as far as you can, sometimes that position might be a little bit provocative. So for someone, if they have a rotator cuff injury, for example, this is typically the type of range of motion that pain might start to pop up. It totally depends on the individual, but that is something that might pop up. And again, you can kind of see where that might have some relevance, for example, in something like a lateral raise exercise. If someone's finding that position to be particularly provocative, then you have to think, what is this position exactly? And what that position is, it's abduction, but it's abduction in a particular shoulder rotation. Okay, so if Paddy's in this position as he is with the palm down, then you can see the pit of the elbow, the cubital fossa, is facing forward. So if we were to actually bring his elbow in like this, he's actually in kind of an internally rotated position versus if he's like this. Okay, so if we look at that position, that's external rotation at the shoulder plus abduction of the shoulder, and that's what that is there when his thumb is facing the ceiling. Okay, so that position might be more comfortable for someone because they're not in that internally rotated position that seems to be aggravating the shoulder when we combine internal rotation and abduction. So you can put that down again, Paddy. So what I want you to realize there, guys, is that when you start to look at something like shoulder abduction, you're not looking at one singular pure movement. You're looking at basically a combination of movements within the shoulder joint where you have to be able to, you know, have some flexion available, but there's also different degrees of range of motion, or different degrees of rotation rather, as you move throughout the abduction range of motion. So you might have a client who is completely tolerant of doing some sort of exercise like a shoulder press where they're in a little bit more external rotation, but once you take them into internal rotation in something like an upright row or a lateral raise, then that might be something that's provocative for them. So being aware of the range of motion that's available and what is a provocative position and what isn't can help you to make better exercise decisions. So with that said, then we've mentioned rotation already. So how you can look at active rotation is starting with external rotation. So if you start with your hand like that for me, Paddy, what I want to do here is make sure that as I'm looking at this, I'm getting Paddy to keep his elbow in by his side. So if you keep the elbow there for me, Paddy, I'm going to put my hand there and he goes out into that external rotation range of motion. I can see he's got lots of active external rotation available, and basically what you're looking for is the elbow to be in a static position, the trunk to be in a static position, and for the arm to be able to rotate out like that, and that's your external rotation range of motion. But what you have to realize is that that's also external rotation range of motion at 0 degrees of shoulder flexion effectively. So what you also might want to look at is, all right, we're at 90 degrees of abduction now, and let's see how much external rotation you have now. Because that's a position that you'll actually start to see recreated in a lot of exercises. So for example, the most exaggerated version of this would be something like a behind the neck press, because Paddy has to be able to keep that arm behind his head the whole time, okay? So if you've got a client coming into you and you're getting them to do a behind the neck press right out the gate, but when you actually look at their shoulder range of motion, they have only got maybe 20, 30 degrees relative to that position, then all of the rest of this range of motion is coming forced by the bar. So it's purely the bar forcing them into that position, and that mightn't necessarily be what you want, especially if you've got someone who maybe has a history of shoulder injury or something like that, okay? So you can put that down again, Paddy, that's fine. So far, we've gone through active shoulder flexion, active shoulder abduction, and active external rotation at both 0 degrees of shoulder flexion and 90 degrees of shoulder abduction, okay? So from there, you've also got internal rotation. So when it comes to internal rotation, again, there are a number of ways you can look at this. The first one would just be starting in the same position again, Paddy, wrist out in front, and just coming to touch your tummy. Okay, everyone's going to have that available. The vast majority of people you're going to look at are going to be able to get that range of motion. Generally, you're not going to be as restricted getting into internal rotation as you will be getting into external rotation. That's generally going to be a little bit more difficult for people. But what you might want to look at instead is, if you come up to the 90 degrees of abduction again, now bring your palm down towards the floor. Again, trying to keep this elbow in a static position. That's how you make sure it's coming from the shoulder. And again, when I look at that, Paddy's got plenty of range of motion available there. So if you actually sit facing that way again just for a second, you probably get a better view of that here, guys. So what you can see is that this hand is coming down, you know, you've got lots of range of motion there. So what we can see is that from here to here, we've got maybe 75 to 80 degrees of rotation range of motion. You won't see that in many individuals, and sometimes you might get kind of a false positive here again. If someone rounds their shoulders forward a lot, it's easier to get into that position, okay? But as we can see, Paddy's got lots of range of motion available there, so that might be important for something like dips, for example. If someone's doing wide grip dips, or they're doing upright rows, or they're doing like lateral raises with their thumb pointing down, for example. So if you bring that up to the side, that's similar to doing a lateral raise with the thumb towards the floor. You can rest that again. Just thinking about, all right, that's what the person has available. These are the exercises we're thinking of doing. Again, it doesn't mean you have to screen in advance, but what it does kind of allow you to do is, if someone is having a problem with a particular exercise, or they report that this group of exercises are all particularly provocative, or I find it difficult to get into these positions, then a quick assessment like that can sometimes be helpful in terms of highlighting what the issue might be. And then finally, you've got shoulder extension range of motion, and this kind of also brings in internal rotation. So we'll finish off the internal rotation first. So can you put your hand behind your back for me, Paddy? So basically I want to see how high you can touch on your back with your hand, and basically that's going to test someone's internal rotation range of motion again. And normally you'd kind of just measure that by seeing how high can someone go. So what we can see there is that Paddy's able to get up pretty much up to his cervical spine almost, and then do the other side just for the crack. Sorry, he's actually got a sore shoulder on that side, so unfair of me. But what you can see is that the range of motion is similar there between sides. And in some elderly individuals in particular, if they've got a history of shoulder injury, they mightn't even get their hand behind their back, you know. So where things like that become relevant, especially as we move on to shoulder extension, is if you're getting someone to do dips and you're saying, hey, go as deep as possible, you know, and that mightn't always be appropriate. So with that said, let's have a look at shoulder extension. So shoulder extension is pretty simple, guys. It's literally bringing the arm back behind the body. So if you let your arm down straight and just bring it back behind the body, as if you're almost doing some sort of tricep extension, okay? And what you want to make sure here is that the person isn't just reaching out to the side, that they are trying to reach back as much as they can. And what we can see there is that, again, Paddy's got plenty of range of motion available there. And if we think about what does that actually look like, that looks a bit like a dip, you know? So if Paddy's got his arm bent up, that's a bit like a dip. And what you have to realize is that you're also almost always bent forward on a dip as well. So do remember how that plays into things. But if Paddy did that movement and I said, oh, you know, Paddy, I just want to have a look at your shoulder extension range of motion, and he got to like here and he couldn't go any further, and he's saying, no, there's no way I can get any further than that, then it wouldn't make a whole pile of sense for me to say, right, Paddy, I'm going to pop you into dips and I want you to go down as deep as you possibly can. Because basically what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be stretching him into a position that he may not have, not that he's never been there before, but he's certainly never been there under load actively. He's never brought himself into that position, and that just mightn't be the smartest idea for someone who has some sort of restriction in range of motion. So with all of that said, guys, that gives you the most of what you need to know in terms of the active assessment of the shoulder joint range of motion. Just remember, when you are looking at these things, if you are going to look at these things, have a look between sides always. That's always going to be helpful, especially if someone appears to be having some sort of unilateral issue. For example, someone might say, when I'm doing a dumbbell shoulder press, the right side feels great to bring it down, but the left side feels real tight and I feel like I have to move my elbow. If you do a quick assessment and you see, okay, external rotation range of motion is reduced on the left side, then that might explain why you are seeing that appear, okay? Now, with all that said, that brings us on to the assessment of passive range of motion. And to be fair, this isn't something that's probably going to be as relevant in terms of on-the-floor personal training, but there might be cases where you might want to assess it, or where you might want to at least be aware of it. And the easiest way to do this for an individual is when they're actually lying down. So if you want to lie down on the bench for me, Paddy. Basically, as I said, guys, passive range of motion is all about seeing what the individual has available at the joint itself, pretty much. So when you're assessing active range of motion, what you have to realize is that there's an element of strength involved in that. So you're always looking at, you know, what are the person's muscles able to do, the agonist muscles in a particular movement. So when we're looking at the shoulder joint, we're thinking about what are the deltoids able to do, what are the biceps doing, what's the rotator cuff doing. You're basically looking at the integrity and the function of all of those muscles, as well as what's going on within the joint and everything around that, okay? Whereas when you look at passive range of motion, you're basically taking the muscle work out of it, and you're basically saying, what does this joint actually have available when we look at it in isolation, okay? So that might, in some cases, at least in a physiotherapy context, that can help you narrow down different diagnoses. Obviously, as personal trainers, that's not necessarily something that we're interested in, but it might still give you an idea of why someone's not getting into a particular range of motion. And to give you an example of why this might be relevant, you know, you might see that someone's not getting up to at the top of a range of motion that you think is important. For example, the top of a shoulder press, right? They're not able to get up all the way, and you might conclude that this person is just weak. They need to gain more strength in that position because they're too weak to do the task. However, what could be going on is that there's actually a passive range of motion restriction, and that even if you gain all the strength in the world in your deltoids, it's not going to change because there's limitations, whether that be related to the bony anatomy itself, whether it be the ligaments around the joint capsule, etc., that there could be other things going on restricting that aren't specific to muscle strength itself. So that's important to be aware of. So with that said, guys, looking at shoulder flexion range of motion first and foremost, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get Paddy to relax his arm completely. And of course, there's many ways you can do this. If you have like a plinth, like a bed in your gym, then that's the best way to assess this. But basically, you could even do this with someone that's just standing up. You could do like an active assisted, where someone lifts up most of the way and you help them out the rest. But a real basic way of doing this is, right, Paddy relaxes his arm, and I'm just going to bring that arm into the most amount of shoulder flexion that's available. So I'm taking all this weight off him, and then I'm going to bring it down and see how much range of motion he has available. Now, you can argue about the best way of doing that in terms of handling and all that sort of stuff, but leave that to the physiotherapist, okay? I'm just trying to show you from the perspective of the camera, and it'll totally depend on the height of the bed that you're kind of assessing someone on and that sort of stuff. But basically, you just want to take the weight off the arm, assess the person's range of motion, see what it feels like. So if I take Paddy into that position again, and it comes down here, and he's saying to me, he's kind of giving out, he's saying his shoulder's real cramping or it's spasming, that might be a different phenomenon to something like, all right, it's just real hard, there's definitely nothing more there, and again, that's more so physiotherapy related, but it does still give you an idea that, okay, maybe we don't want to provoke that range of motion by pushing the person really, really far, because passively there seems to be some sort of restriction as well, and hence it mightn't just be a strength issue. So you can go through that for all the ranges of motion. So from an abduction perspective, again, similar idea. You're starting with the arm out at the side there, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it up overhead, and you can see Paddy's got full abduction range of motion there passively as well. Similar idea again, guys, for something like shoulder external rotation. So Paddy, you're going to keep that there for me, and I'm going to bring the arm out. Again, when you're assessing rotation, always you're trying to support the upper arm to make sure that that is fixed. You're creating an axis for rotation, and then you're holding the arm as you bring it out to the side. And again, plenty of range of motion available there. What I might see is that, it's actually stopping here. There's nothing more there, and again, that could give you an idea that, there's actually a passive range of motion restriction here, and maybe I don't want to force the person beyond that during exercise, okay? So yeah, he's stuck there, I'm not getting him any further. So yeah, that's basically what you're trying to have a look at, okay? Similar idea with internal rotation or external rotation out at 90 degrees even. You can take the person out to there. You can say, right, I'm just going to bring the arm down here. Again, elbow in place. Internal rotation, other side, external rotation, and again, just seeing what the person has available, okay? So basically, what I wanted to get across there was a quick idea of what a passive range of motion assessment looks like, because to be honest, I'm more concerned with you guys being aware of the active stuff, because it's really the active range of motion that we're generally concerned with. Passive range of motion assessments can be helpful. They're more so helpful in a physiotherapy context, and I mean, as a personal trainer, you mightn't necessarily be in a position to put a client on the plinth and say, I'm going to do a full passive range of motion assessment of all your joints and see what's available, etc. But in some cases, you might want to. So as I said, as a recap, if you're thinking about creating exercises for your clients, you want to think about, what are they presenting with? What do they have available? Okay, so what range of motion does someone have available? Am I exploiting that by trying to get them to do an arbitrary range of motion? The example we gave was something like a dip. If someone can't put their arm behind their body, maybe we don't want to force that by having them push their body weight down as deep as they can possibly go. It might be something you gradually expose them to over time, but it's probably not something that you want to immediately do, okay? So when you are trying to have a look at your client's range of motion in a context that you think is appropriate, I would start by having a look at their active range of motion at the shoulder joint, see what's available there, see how that correlates with their performance on different exercises. And then if you need to, you could have a look at the passive range of motion. So if you see that someone's shoulder flexion, this is the example I gave, if you see their shoulder flexion is limited and you think, oh, it's just that they don't have enough strength, it could be worth looking at the passive range of motion quickly just to see that this may actually be something other than just purely strength. And that is why this stuff can be important in certain contexts and will help you to provide a better service to your clients.